Hello, in-store audience and virtual audience. Hi. Today we have a first for Mysterious Galaxy. Not only do we have a book signing discussion, but also a workshop connected to it. Everyone give a nice round of applause for Brandie June. So not only is she a novelist, but she went to UCLA to study acting, then went into costume design, playwright, and into marketing.
Mm-hmm.
You're a Jackie of all trades. I love it.
I stay busy.
Today we're here to celebrate the second book in the duology, CURSE Undone, the sequel to Goldspun. For anyone who's tuning in, if you have any questions that you want to ask during the event, you can go ahead and submit it under the Ask a Question button below, and we'll make sure to ask those later in the program. And you also can purchase your own copies of Goldspun and CURSE Undone. If you click a link, that'll take you to the website. For everyone in store, you can also purchase in store. Thank you so much. I'll take it away.
Wonderful. Thank you. All right. Can you guys hear me? Great. Thank you guys so much for coming. I'm so excited. My first book, Goldspun, came out mid-pandemic last year. So pretty much everything I did was virtual. So it's really exciting to be able to actually see people in person. And also to see people, because my fear is always that no one will show up and I'll just be by myself. So thank you for that as well. So I guess how many people are familiar with Goldspun and or have read the first book? Okay. So Goldspun, I'm delighted to see you guys here. Goldspun is a Rumpelstiltskin retelling told from the miller's daughter's point of view. Except in my telling, she is a con artist, and the Rumpelstiltskin character is a mysterious fairy boy, and then hijinks ensue. It's a duology, so while Goldspun will leave you hanging a bit, CURSE Undone, I think, ties it up in what I hope is a satisfying way. It was satisfying for me, and I wrote it, so I get to say. And yeah, so I can start with, if any of you guys have any questions about, either the books or fairy tales, writing, publishing, the best way to get purple hair coloring. I'm very open. Yes. Hello. That's an excellent question. And I think, how many people are staying for the fairy tale workshop? Okay, so that'll be great too, that I go through some exercises too that'll help you really customize the characters. One thing that drew me to Rumpelstiltskin is there hadn't been a lot of retellings when I started to have the idea for Goldspun. And something else is that I love old fairy tales, especially like the dark ones, but a lot of times the characters are so flat. So in Rumpelstiltskin, I always felt like the miller's daughter got really kind of jilted in the way that she's just this poor damsel in distress, wilting flower, because it's the king who makes her do it. It's her dad who says that she can spin the gold. So for me, I really wanted to give her more agency, which is why I made her a con artist, because I'm like, well, if people think she can spin gold because she is telling them that, at least she's getting herself into trouble. And so because that was really where I found the core of her character, it really helped me develop her into something that was different than just this poor, wilting character who had no real say in her future. So at least if she's getting in trouble, she's the one doing it. And I really love flipping the different tropes a lot of times. So Pell, who's the Rumpelstiltskin character in mine, instead of kind of being this ugly, impish, evil creature that you have in the original, and what if he was a really hot fairy boy? Because that would be different. And then that really helped shape what he would look like. The first thing I did before I even did any outlining for this is I wrote a short story featuring the Rumpelstiltskin as a hero character instead of a villain. and it gave me a really fun way of thinking about him differently. And so even though Goldspun, you know, I kind of pulled back. I wanted him to be a little more mysterious, a little more morally gray. But it was really a fun way to sort of separate my story from the original. So those are some of the things I've done to kind of differentiate it. And I also give myself permission if an element of my story doesn't fit with the original, or if there's something in the original that doesn't fit in mine. So in the original, she promises her firstborn, and in my telling, I wasn't, you know, her having a child wasn't really where I saw the narrative within this book. So I'm like, well, it's my retelling. I will throw that out. So the nice thing is with a retelling is you can make it your own. And some of my critique partners were like, but this happened in the original. I'm like, yeah, but I'm not rewriting the original. I'm writing my version. So, yes, who else had a question? Yes, you. It was Rumpelstiltskin, but even before that, how many people are familiar with NaNoWriMo? So National Novel Writing Month, you write 50,000 words in the month of November. And one year I didn't have a good idea for like a big story, but I wanted to participate. So I decided, okay, for every letter of the alphabet, I'm going to write a short story based on a fairy tale, based on a character in mythology, based on something like that. I did not get to all 26 letters. But for R, I decided Rumpelstiltskin, and this was the short where I'm like, what if he was the hero instead of the villain? So it really just started as this short story, and once I got into that short story, I was like, this is fun. I want to expand on it. And so I was already enjoying the Rumpelstiltskin idea, enjoying the what if he's not fully a villain. And then from there kind of came to the, well, I'd love to give the female character a lot more agency. You know, if people think she can do this thing, and maybe it's because she tells them. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Con, con, con. So that is how I came to decide to do a Rumpelstiltskin retelling. Yeah, sure. Anyone else have any? Yes. My favorite part. Clearly, it's when I get to do signings and meet all of you. Or a book cake. Book cakes are fun. But no, more seriously, I love the problem solving element where I'll spend a lot of time just sort of kind of daydreaming about the characters and about the world. And then, you know, eventually when I have a sense of who the characters are and sort of rough plot points, I'll start putting it out into a more organized outline. And either there or even in the writing process, when I come up to some sort of like roadblock that I'm really stuck on, and in the first draft, a lot of times just to keep the flow of it, I'll make myself a note of like, write epic battle here, just so I can keep going and don't get too stuck. But when it clicks and you're like, oh, this is how they solve the problem, or, you know, this is how the meet cute is going to happen, and sort of that like feeling like the puzzle pieces are coming together. And sometimes that happens in outlining. Sometimes it's all the way down when I'm editing. But like that little magical clicking is what I really love. So, yes. I had to do, the short story is vastly different and a lot more simplified than the book. But because I wanted a character who was morally gray and sort of kind of walks this line, there were definitely times where when I was going back to edit, I either had to like pull him back or make him, you know, there were definitely times where I'm like, okay, maybe he's a little less evil here. Or other times where I'm like, you know, maybe he's being too good. Maybe he needs to be a little more mischievous here. So it was definitely something that I took care of. I worried about when I was editing. So what works for me, and writing, unfortunately, is what works for everyone in their own way. But for me, I have to get through the first draft. So I have to give myself permission to write a horrible, messy, awful first draft that I try not to do much in the way of rereading until I've gotten the whole thing done, because then I can go back and start editing. But if I get bogged down with, oh, this chapter looks terrible, then I generally never get further than that. So it was definitely something where I'm like, I'm just going to get the story out first, and then I'll go back and decide, just how evil he should or should not be. So, and it was fun because there are definitely times where he is, more of a hero, and there are other times where he's clearly not. So it was really fun to play with that too. Yes. I had scenes in my head early on when I was in the outlining stage, or even before the outlining stage. A lot of times I will just think about the characters for a while. And even early then, I had this idea of like a big ball gown scene with the big gold dress, because gold and balls. And so there were definitely a couple scenes that I saw very clearly. But once I kind of outlined the whole thing, the actual writing of the rough draft was very much chapter 1 through the end. And going back to edit, certain chapters had to get cut or others had to be added. And a lot of, the prologues and the epilogues got added later. But my process is, once I start writing, generally I try to do beginning to end just as my own process. So. Yeah, all right. Does anyone have any other questions? Yes. Internet question. Yes. Hello, Internet.
What have been some of the pros and cons we found for writing retellings of well-known stories?
All right. So the pros are that it makes it easier to describe it to other people. If you're like, oh, my retelling is Rumpelstiltskin meets con artist. So there is something that's kind of inherently known about a retelling in the way that we know these original stories pretty well for the most part. By the other, the flip side of that is, though, you can get a lot of retellings, especially when you're getting a lot of this retellings of the same fairy tale. It can get hard to differentiate, okay, but what specifically about yours makes it special? I find that a lot of great retellings do a wonderful job of really customizing their worlds. So there's even several other Rumpelstiltskin retellings that I really enjoy. There's Gilded, there's Spinning Silver, which I adore. And they're also different because they really customize their own world. So I think that is, can be a pro for certain. One of the cons is if you do start to feel like you're too confined to these characters or this world or this framework, if you have a harder time being like, yes, this is sort of the bones of it, but we're also going to grow another arm and really make it our own. So, yeah. Yes. I grew up as a theater kid. I'm still a big theater nerd. I went to school for undergrad to do theater. And so I think that has really helped me kind of how I visualize worlds in the way of like, I see it similar to if it was going out on stage, this is what the blocking would look like. This is what the scenery would look like. So it makes me very conscious of kind of how the world looks. So I think that has really influenced a lot of my writing. I think there was also, when I was growing up, there was a lot of books that were the chosen one trope. And in instances that can be great. I feel like there was a time where that felt so overwhelming to me that I really wanted to play with the opposite of that. So in Goldspun, Nora doesn't have the wealth or the power or the magic that other characters in the book have. And so she has to figure out, okay, I don't have any of these things. How can I make my way in the world? And for her, it is deception and trickery that come together. The first book that I wrote and edited and got to the point of querying got me so far, but it actually went out on submission and it never sold. So if I had kind of been like, it's not selling, done with writing, off to something else, then Goldspun would have never happened. But instead, when it was out being shopped around, I was working on writing Goldspun, figuring, well, if this first book doesn't sell, then look, I have something else to pitch. So that was a very long answer to, am I doing Nano? Yes. Rumpelstiltskin. No, I do like Rumpelstiltskin. The Curse Undone was really fun for me because while Goldspun was a lot of the original Rumpelstiltskin, it was a lot of, human palace, castle intrigue. Curse Undone moves a lot of the story into the fairy realms. And for that, I got to go a lot kind of wilder. And so there are elements of the Wild Swan retelling, the Hans Christian Andersen story of the princess whose brothers are turned into swans, and she has to weave all the nettle shirts. And there are elements of that. I don't want to give too much away, but there's elements of that in the second one. And I love diving into it because to me, that is also such a dark story of this girl is, she has to be silent while weaving these things that are cutting up her fingers. And it's so horrible for her, but she's not only persevering, but I did like finding a fairy tale where the girl was taking a lot of the lead action and not waiting around for someone to come save her. So I really had fun with that one too. Yes. Oh, you and then yes. Oh, that was fun. I actually thought it would be a trilogy. And when I was writing Goldspun, I knew the whole story was not going to fit in one book. And in my mind, I was like, it'll be a trilogy. So after I wrote Goldspun, when that was being shopped to publishers, I wrote a very rough draft of Curse Undone, thinking it would be book 2 of 3. And then once my publisher picked up Goldspun and we started to have some discussions about what the rest of the story series would look like, we did eventually come up with the decision that based on the arc that I had, a duology would make sense. And I perfectly agree with it now. But I did have a very interesting process where when I was editing, I basically had this huge rough draft that I then had to cut in half and then write the whole ending to, which was very exciting to do on a deadline. So when my publisher offered me the contract for the second book, that's when I knew it would be a duology. Yes, internet question. Personal rule, as in a moral rule or a morality? So I think that's a great question. What I love about retellings is because we are looking at them in a different context than when they were originally told, a lot of times the morals are completely different from the original tale. So in the original Rumpelstiltskin, the heroine is basically rewarded by being kind of so passive and, pure and not ruffling feathers. Whereas in mine, I very much wanted it to be, hey, you're taking action, you are deciding your own future. My main character gets to decide if she wants to continue her life of crime or not. So that is definitely one way I think I flipped the moral telling of the original. And something that I found that became a really big theme between both books is sort of this fear of the other and the outsider and the prejudice therein. Because in the first book, there's like, oh, there's the fairies. We don't know much about them. They're mysterious and scary and probably will eat small babies. So I had a lot of fun playing with the idea of like the prejudice against them. And then once my main character is kind of really forced to face off with them and deal with them, discovering, you know, is that a valid thing to say about them? Is that just a prejudice because they're unknown? And ultimately, especially in the second book, when you meet a lot more fairies, realizing, you know, just kind of like people, some are there. It's not a, you know, you can't go with one stereotype for a whole group. Some are fantastic and wonderful, and others are just out for their own self-interest, as with people. So, you know, playing with that prejudice was a lot of fun to kind of look at. So, yes, internet. Oh, I watch cartoons and snuggle with my puppies. And sometimes there's chocolate involved. My husband actually has a rule now. Every time I get a book deal, he owes me cheesecake. But yeah, there's definitely been times with these books, as well as some of the other stuff I'm writing, that gets really emotionally heavy. And even though a lot of my work, pretty much most all of my work, is fantasy, I try to keep the emotions as genuine as I can. So there are definitely scenes that do get very heavy. And after that, yeah, I feel like watching some lighthearted cartoons and petting a puppy is sort of what I do. Ooh, coffee. Does coffee count as a snack? Yes, coffee. It's a lot harder to edit with whiskey. Definitely during COVID, my coffee game upped quite a bit. So now, like, I do a double shot of espresso over ice and almond milk is my go-to, especially because then you get a giant mug of it. Whereas if you try a giant mug just of espresso, I cannot recommend that. Yeah, so actually, speaking of puppies, a fun fact is right after I got the book deal for Goldspun, we adopted our second puppy. And so my husband's like, you just got this book deal. You should name her Nor after your main character, which I did. And she's adorable. And like Nor, she is a little con artist who likes to steal things, often in the form of turkey sandwiches. Yes. Ooh, so many. Yes. I always try to flesh out a lot of my supporting cast, and because I want them to also be interesting people. So Nor has two brothers who I think have three brothers, and they get into, you know, her younger brother who's close to age than her is very clever and gets into, you know, a lot more can like notice things that some of her other brothers miss. So I think he'd be very fun. There's also the prince's character, his sister and her girlfriend. I really wanted to kind of examine their relationship a bit and do give them a couple moments in the sun, which I really like. And that was one of the fun things too with Curse Undone. Kind of sad, but also very special of figuring out how these stories wrap up, not just in the main characters, but also, you know, the supporting cast, many of whom have been such an important part of both books. Yes. Ooh, great question. So I'd say after I worked with some beta readers, and especially in Goldspun, I also worked with an editor separately before submitting. And basically when it got to the point where I'm like, okay, I can't see any way to make this better, which is what I usually do on my own. And then I talk to beta readers and, you know, I get their feedback, and some of it I incorporate, some of it I don't, but I do listen to all of it. And when I get to the point where I'm like, I can't think of any way to make this better, Then I will listen to the whole thing using the auto speak on Word, because that's a great way to pick up on writing mistakes that you keep rereading the same mistake because you know what it should say. So listening to it out loud helps. So that'll usually be like the final step, and then I send it off into the world. Yes. Oh, yes, Santa. I mean, they were both very stressful in different ways. I feel like with my own anxieties, I feel like not knowing if Gold Spun was going to get picked up was a bigger stressor for me. But it was definitely a challenge with the second. I think what helped with the second is I at least had a rough draft. Even if I had to cut it in half and write the ending, at least I wasn't starting from a blank page. I think if that was the case, that probably would have been more stressful for me. But at least I had sort of a rough framework. I had a sense of where I wanted it to go. And at that point, I knew I was going to have a team. So I knew once I was done with the draft of Curse Undone, then I would send it to the editor at the publishing house and we'd work on it a bit. So I think the first one, and even if it was not so much the act of writing it, it was the act of sending it out, which for me was very stressful. And again, also a reason why I think it's great having a support group and a writing community so that you're not just stressing out on your own. You can stress out with other people. Did someone else? Yes. You know, it kind of depends. I feel like I send it to usually 5 to 15 and don't usually always get all of them to write back, which is fine. I view a lot of beta readers as they're doing me a favor by reading it, which I appreciate. But it also means I'm not upset if they can't get to it. So usually 5 to 15, and I'd say, probably 3 to 7 is whom I get substantial feedback on. And then what I like is I don't want so many that I get overwhelmed with opinions, but I do like having at least a couple, because that way if someone brings up an issue, it does help me to be like, okay, did just one person have an issue? If this element is unclear to several people, then maybe I really should go back and kind of take a look. And, also working with beta readers who understand this is greatly appreciated feedback, but just because I'm getting the feedback doesn't mean I'm gonna, make the change. But I try to definitely go in with an open mind, and I take notes. I basically take notes on their notes and kind of let it percolate in my brain a bit. I have a manuscript I'm working on right now that I'm getting some feedback on, and kind of thinking of like, oh, okay, I can kind of see like this is an area maybe I'll tweak to make it a little stronger, or this is an issue someone had, but they were the only one who had this issue. So, I might let it go. So, yeah. And I know a great way to find beta readers also is if you do have writing friends and swapping. So I've done that before too, of like, I'll read yours, you read mine, or if a critique group where, maybe each week or each month someone submits a couple chapters, I found that more helpful when I'm in the process of writing, especially when I was early on. Now I kind of write my whole draft by myself, but earlier on I found it very helpful to like swap some chapters. Whereas now, if I have a whole book, I want kind of a sense of like, what did you think of the pacing overall? So, yes. Mm-hmm. I did a fair amount of research. I definitely reread Rumpelstiltskin, but that's a couple pages. Where I did a lot of the research is, even though it is Fantasyland, I try to ground it in a similar to. So I have similar to European, late medieval, early Renaissance with a lot of made up fluff, but I like to set it in a different world, because otherwise I'd be like, oh no, the King of England at the time was so-and-so. Whereas this, I could be like, nope, here are the politics I'm making. But it was helpful to be like, okay, but people of this time period in this kind of location, this is sort of the foods they ate. This is kind of the clothes they wore. This is, the kind of trees that grew in local forests. And so that was a good place for me to start. But I will say I inject plenty of made up things as well. But what I tend to do a lot of research into is like, what does the day-to-day life look like? Because that way you can add in a lot of the like small but specific details. Like, you don't want to overwhelm someone with details, or it just becomes this info dump. But if you have a few that are just extremely specific, they can be really helpful to make someone feel like they're there. Did you have a question? Yes. Excellent question. I finished the first draft of Goldspun before the first one even got sent out. And for me, what's been really helpful is I'm actually requerying now for an agent. I had to part ways with my last one. And I found the process of querying and the process of submitting to publishers is rather stressful for me. And I tend to be an overachiever, as you might have noticed by all of this lovely tablecloths I brought from home. So it's difficult for me when I'm like, okay, this is now out in the world, and whether an agent or a publisher, really whoever picks up the book or likes the book, it's out of my hands at that point. So what I found really helpful for me is I can't say instead of, but to mitigate my stress about that would be to work on another project. So that actually was really helpful for me when, if I'm querying a book and I'm sending it out to agents, there's nothing more I can do at that point except wait. But what I can actively do is I can write my next book. I can be researching for another book. I can be drafting and editing. And that is something I can control and manage. And that way, no matter what happens with the book that's already out there, I will have another project. So if the first one doesn't go anywhere, I have a new project to bring to the table. Or if the first project does go somewhere, I can be like, and also I have this other thing. So really by working on the writing has really helped me. And I think the more I write, the better a writer I become. So that's also just a helpful thing to do instead of anxiously waiting, checking emails every 5 minutes. Yes. The biggest challenge with world building. I think that the biggest challenge for me was coming up with the magic system and its rules, because I wanted a magic system that was, especially in Goldspun, I wanted it to be kind of scary and unknown, because only the Fae have magic in this world. So that kind of gives into more of this, we don't know about the Fae. They're scary, they're terrible, they're evil. And so I wanted to come up with what's the magic system going to be that they can use that is not inherently evil, but could be interpreted that way and has a lot of weight. So, what can it do? But also I don't want it to do so much, because I prefer my magic to be rather limited, because I find if it's too all-powerful, it's too easy to solve problems that way, and I like to make my characters struggle. So for me, it was really coming up with what is the magic system? And I kind of came up with sort of this transformation magic that Pell, who's the Rumpelstiltskin character, has, that he uses in Goldspun. And then when I went to Curse Undone, because in Goldspun you don't see, you're very limited on the number of Fae that you're interacting with for the most part. But a lot of Curse Undone happens in the fairy realm. So then it was, how do I want to expand on this? Do all of the Fae here have the same magic system? Or do they have a different magic system? And what I found really fun to play with is that actually then became my power system in the second book, because the first book, a lot of it is classist. Nor is a poor commoner. There's the king, all the wealth, and so you see the difference in status that way. Whereas in the fairy realms, they're not so much worried about who has more gold, but a lot of it is who has the more magic, who has more magic, who has the most powerful magic, and that then becomes how the hierarchy is. So I'd say kind of developing that and coming up with rules that worked without letting things go too out of control was a challenge. Yes. That's a good question. I think it was a bit of both. I had loose ideas early on how I wanted it to work. So it's pretty clear early on that, that Pell needs blood. Blood is involved, and there's this transformation magic, because I needed him to make some gold. And how was he going to do that? And I thought I kept with blood because on one hand, it does feel very old fairy tale. And on another, I did want it to have weight and be potentially misinterpreted as something evil and scary, even though it's really how you use it. And that was one point where I did have my editor go, I don't know, do you want to do maybe tears? It's not quite so scary. I was like, no, I want it to have weight. This should be a dangerous, scary thing. So I had the initial idea for it early on. And then later it was sort of coming up with the nuances that came in later during the writing and during the editing of well, what can we transform? What can't? Where's the, where are the limits of the magic? Thank you.
I'm going to say goodbye to our virtual audience because we're going to go ahead and begin our signing portion. They'll give you all a chance to stretch your legs before we get into the workshop. Thank you so much. Bye.